Thank you for joining us for 3Bs on the Law podcast, hosted by Trisha Barita, Camille Canali, and Susan Dawson. Disclaimer, this podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only, not meant to provide legal advice, and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Also remember, laws change or they differ by jurisdiction, so this is not a substitute for seeking legal counsel in your jurisdiction on the current law applicable to you. Hey, welcome to 3Bs on the Law podcast. So over the course of the last several months, employers have had to make a lot of decisions related to whether or not they're going to have to reduce their workforce in some way. And so some of the thoughts have been whether or not that's going to be a permanent or temporary layoff or furlough. Do you have any thoughts on that, Camille?
Well, I think that's a tough choice for most employers. And I think the decision to lay off and furlough sounds a little nicer, don't you think?
Sure.
Than a layoff. So do you think there's a difference between the two? Because I know in California, some lawyers say they're exactly the same. Other lawyers say there's slight differences, like a furlough is supposed to be temporary. So what are your thoughts on that, Trisha?
I think that it's a confusing part for some employers. They sometimes get confused as to whether or not furlough is something that just sounds nicer. And so they choose it because it's an easier way to sort of let employees know that they still value them, but that they, due to economic issues, are going to have to let them go. So it's kind of a tough choice. In all reality, they probably shouldn't be using the word furlough because they probably are going to be having to permanently lay off some employees. But it's something that they do, I think, at least they've done here over the last several months because of COVID-19, because it was such a fast way for employers to have to communicate that they're in an economic crisis and they have to let some people go.
And I think one of the things we need to mention here at the outset is we're really not today talking about the WARN Act, and both federally and I know many states have waived some of those requirements of notifying employees. So I just want to make sure that people are aware that the WARN Act is still out there, and you should check with your state to see what requirements there are with respect to the WARN Act at this juncture, just in case certain provisions haven't been waived or not. Didn't you agree, Susan?
Right. Yeah. You need to be aware of WARN Act, but I think we're focusing on just talking about general furloughs and layoffs, maybe smaller businesses, hopefully that aren't qualifying for WARN, ones that aren't used to having these large layoffs. Many businesses I'm talking to say, just like you said, Trisha, they say, well, I'm going to furlough employees. And I say, are you furloughing them or laying them off? And well, I don't know. Right. They don't know the difference because for so long, furlough was not a term that was used by people in the private sector. So it's something that's new, this furlough term, and we're all catching up. But it does sound nicer. It sounds less like you said, like, hey, get out of here, you're all fired. Right? We're just going to furlough you, put you on the shelf for a couple of weeks. It's interesting, but it still has all the same trickiness that a layoff has, right? Just because you're using the term furlough versus layoff doesn't mean that you can, you don't have to be careful, right? And Camille, I know we were talking earlier about some of the discrimination issues you still have to think about with a furlough.
Right. And so you want to make, employers especially want to make sure that they're not inadvertently discriminating against employees. And this is where having your organizational structure. And by the way, if you're laying off or recalling employees, it's a great time to review and adapt your organizational structure to what your organization actually looks like, and to have job descriptions and to fill employees based upon job descriptions, and not, kind of willy-nilly lay people off and bring people back based upon potentially discriminatory categories that if you don't have job descriptions, just the potential is there. And that's why I always think, as you know, I always say document. Right. And these documents are very important to back up your claim that you didn't do anything for discriminatory purpose.
That's a good point, though, that it gives a business owner, while it's never a good thing to have to do these mass layoffs and furloughs, and certainly so many businesses are struggling right now through the COVID pandemic, but it is an opportunity too to really take a look at your business. What are the jobs that we need? What are the roles that we need? What do can they telework? Can they not? I think of it, you ever packed up and moved your house, right? It's like an opportunity. It sucks, but it's an opportunity to clean house and really organize and really figure out what you need and what you don't. So think of it maybe that way a little bit. There's an opportunity there, but there's still, you need to be careful. I know that a furlough is generally considered to be a shorter term layoff, right, Trisha?
I think it can be. I don't think there's a lot of rules. There may be rules in particular to like localities, but it's supposed to be thought of as a temporary. And you actually, in some circumstances, in order to secure the economic impact, they already know when they're going to bring them back because they need to do this sort of temporary layoff in order to bring them back. And here in Texas, it's not even an option on the unemployment form for you to pick furlough. It's a temporary layoff with the return date. So it is a little confusing. A lot of employers are trying to figure out how to fill that out here. And I was kind of like, it's really a temporary layoff. And if you don't know the return date, it's maybe not a furlough, but they didn't like that because they didn't want to fire people, right? So they wanted to do it anyway. And so some furloughs could have no date in return. And here with COVID, we've seen a lot of that, of course, where they've had no return date. So it isn't temporary as much as they would like. I think it's very different than a reduction in force, which I think many employers weren't familiar with all these terms because they've never thought of having to lay off more than one person at a time, right?
Right. Some people that I've talked to about, they want a furlough and they don't know when to bring people back. You can actually give that end date, but you can extend. That's what's interesting about furlough, right? Is you can furlough for 2 weeks, but then before the 2 weeks is up, extend it for another 2 weeks. And you can convert a furlough to a layoff eventually. So if you wanted to say, I'm hoping I can bring everybody back in a month, we're going to furlough, provide them a notice, and then make a decision later. Do I convert this to a full layoff? Do I extend? Right. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing if they want to try to have that end date, I guess, for your form, what you're saying.
Yeah. I think that
for your form purposes only it would be, but yeah.
I think you're right. And well, everyone, when people are trying to talk to you about how to fill out the form and the form doesn't offer that, then yeah. But maybe furlough has changed, now with this, because really so many people did do a temporary layoff, and because of the PPP, they were able to bring them back. And so they were successful with that sort of temporary layoff. Now, what are we looking at as many of the PPP loans are now ending? And what is it going to look like? Are they really going to be able to pull off a temporary layoff in such a fashion that a company maybe has never, ever had to do a furlough in order to secure the funds for them to survive when you really don't know what's around the corner? Let's face it. If you own a bar right now, it's a struggle. Because you don't know, at least here in Texas, they're not open unless they're serving food and they have some way to sort of show that the food is over 50%. I mean, they're just not able to function. So what do you do with all the people that work for you there? Is that really going to be a temporary layoff when you have no end in sight to it ever? It feels like.
Right. Right. And here in California, the hospitality industry, as you guys know, is huge. A lot of people come to California for Disneyland and the beach and vacation. And, I know LA County and LA City even have special ordinances that they've passed regarding the recall of certain sets of employees, many of which are in the hospitality type industry. And so it's not even as simple as laying off and furloughing, because once you want to call them back, you have all these sets of rules that you have to comply with, at least in most of the counties and cities in Southern California. So that makes it a little bit, that extra added wrinkle that employers have to deal with in California that makes things tough.
I think it's been a little weird to see all these healthy companies furlough. just because it is COVID and they have suffered, like obviously the airlines, and they're all structured by these, which we should note if you're under unions, you know what I mean? There's a lot of information in those union agreements that have been negotiated out. So how furloughs can happen and what has to happen. But, they're looking at, huge furloughs and when that will end or what that looks like for them, who knows, depending on what happens with people flying and the increase of the tourism industry in general.
Right. I think that I think many people thought that COVID would be over in March by, August that we're going into now. And so I think that the fact that it's not ending is starting to make people a little nervous again.
Well, I'm hearing it's ending December 31st. That's what everyone's telling me. I'm not kidding you. People literally are like, well, in January, Trisha, we're going to be doing this. And I'm like, and what text message did you send to COVID to tell them it's ending December 31st?
The full end date is December 31st. That's great.
I mean, I'm in for it, but
listen, ladies, if I knew that information, I wouldn't be here because I would already have the winning lotto ticket and I'd be on my private island.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, back in March, people thought, oh, it'll be 2 weeks, it'll be a month, maybe it'll be 2 months. Now we're all thinking, gosh, I just hope by next summer we're open up again, right? I mean, it's just, I mean, that's where people did that short-term furlough in the beginning. That's really turned into an automatic, layoff. But Camille, you were talking about recalling people, and that's what's interesting about a furlough. I mean, you could do it with a layoff too. It's just easier with a furlough. If you furlough individuals, but you need them to come back a little bit, maybe they were full-time and you might need them 10 hours a week or here and there or on call. If they're laid off, then you have to rehire. If they're furloughed, they're still listed as employees and you can bring them back, but it can get tricky. How you do the recall.
Right. Like, for example, you have to make sure you pay attention to the exempt versus non-exempt employees, especially if you only have them working part-time.
Right.
That's a tricky one for every employer if they're not familiar with how to handle that appropriately.
Right.
Right. We've got salaried exempt employees and they come back and work 1 hour, they're back. They're you've got to pay them your salary. So you have to, what do you do? If you want that individual to come back on a part-time basis, any ideas?
Well, I think you've got to convert them to an hourly and make them a non-exempt employee. I mean, because if they're not working the hours, they're not full-time. I think that's a pretty easy conversion to do. It's just a matter of dotting your I's and crossing your T's with respect to that conversion.
Right. And document.
Got
right?
it.
Put that in writing. You have been, you're being recalled under the following classification: hourly non-exempt.
Yeah, I think that's tricky with the job descriptions, though. Like what you said, Camille, before, we've talked about if you have two people in the same job and you want to bring them back, but you can really only afford one, right, full-time and the other one part-time, but it's the same job. You're kind of looking at it's just very, very dicey if you start, converting people to hourly that have the same job as someone who you're trying to say is exempt.
Right. Because are you then almost causing that other job to be also non-exempt, even though, because you can have a salaried non-exempt employee. You can't have an hourly exempt employee, but you can have a salaried non-exempt. So
right.
Yeah.
So that's where it becomes important that you look at, for example, are you going to do it based upon seniority? Because maybe you look at the job descriptions first and then you bring people back based upon seniority. And that's how you take care of filling those positions is one potential way. Do you guys have any other suggestions of how that could be handled?
About bringing them back?
Well, if you have two employees that fit the same job description,
oh, right,
but you can only hire one full-time and one part-time. I guess my question was, one of the ways that I think you could potentially remedy that is this most senior person comes in on the full-time position and then the less senior person comes in on the part-time position, but you have to make sure you're doing that consistently.
Yeah, I still think you're going to run into trouble with that job description issue. I mean, the DOL just doesn't, they get so
I think
feisty about that.
well, in Trisha's example, they are doing the exact same thing.
Right.
I think that's the trick, right? And it sounds to me like a longer podcast on the elements of exempt versus non-exempt. And maybe that's what we should try to get into, because I think you're going to have two different jobs. You're not going to be able to just have one job, right? You can't be the same job. So the one who's full-time has to have the control and has to have the responsibility. And the one that's part-time, we have to be able to show a difference in them so that we can get them into that non-exempt.
Let's say you want to hire 2 lawyers, both.
She's not letting this go.
I'm not. I'm just asking hypothetically. I think it's a great, I think there are certain situations where you may find that. And we've gotten way
We're
off
just going to fight it out with you here.
I know we're not talking about furlough, but no, I know what you're saying. I mean, you can still have an exempt employee who's part-time, correct? Right? I mean, they're just never going to hit those 40 hours. Is that what you're saying? I mean, you can have a part-time attorney, clearly an exempt position.
No, it could be non-exempt.
What?
I think it could be non-exempt.
Okay. Now
maybe
a whole nother podcast. I call.
We're just going to agree to disagree on this one. I think that's okay. We're of all legal minds and allowed to differ on this viewpoint for sure.
Game show in our future, exempt or non-exempt.
Oh, I like that. Like Jeopardy almost. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. Right. But, circling back to our furlough versus layoff, I think, what if you were to sum up kind of your one thing, your one takeaway that you wanted people to get out of listening to this discussion, what would it be, Trisha? Picking on you because you pick on Camille earlier.
I think it would clearly be obviously being consistent with who it is that you're actually furloughing, to make sure that you're actually looking to meet, that you're not targeting certain individuals, even though everyone's going to look at the dollar signs first. That's the initial thought, because really that's the purpose, to make sure that you're consistent across the board so there's no discriminatory actions on the initial furloughing of the employees.
Listen, for me, it's the documentation, your organizational structure, your job descriptions, and your notices and recall notices.
I should have told that.
Document.
And for me, it's being careful if you're calling them back for a little bit of work, an hour here, an hour there. Make sure that you're being careful. If you've got an exempt employee that you're calling back, you're going to have an issue later if you don't pay them their salary. So, yeah. So I think we did it. I think we did it. We talked about more than just furlough and recall. We have a couple of new podcast ideas going on here. Look at that.
We do. Yeah. Trisha doesn't look too happy about it.
It's all great. It was great. I love it. Okay. So anyway, thanks for joining us for this podcast on furloughs, layoffs, and other temporary issues related to employees. Thanks for joining us on 3Bs on the Law.
Thank you for joining us on today's podcast of 3Bs on the Law. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast. We also welcome any comments. If you'd like to get in touch with us or suggest a future topic, you can email us at 3THREEBsonthelaw@gmail.com. And because we're lawyers, we need to remind you that this podcast is not meant to provide you with legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.